So this hand comes from the third session between Daniel Negreanu and Doug Polk, and Daniel opens it up on the button with Queen 9 suited, Doug 3-bets with 9-10 off, and Daniel calls, all of which are solver-approved plays, although Doug's 3-bet is within a lower frequency branch of the game tree. The flop is 7 Jack 9 rainbow, and Doug checks with his second pair. Although Doug has the advantage here, on this middling connected board, Daniel will have a number of hands that will be reluctant to fold, including strong hands such as straights, sets, and 2 pairs, marginal hands like second and third pairs, as well as a number of straight draws. This, coupled with Doug being out of position, results in the solver doing a significant amount of checking from the big blind, even as the pre-flop aggressor. And when the solver is doing a significant amount of checking, marginal holdings such as weaker pairs that lose a lot of equity when they bet and are called will often be played somewhat passively, as we can see here with most of Doug's 10-9 off combos checking, although betting small to protect is fine as well. And in Daniel's shoes, we see a similar overall strategy, with many of his middling and lower pairs simply checking back, as his range is somewhat symmetrical to Doug's on this flop. His second pairs could benefit from protection by getting overcards to fold, but on the other hand, if Doug is playing a balanced strategy, which we assume is the case, he likely has some traps in his checking range that should deter Daniel from growing the pot with a marginal hand. The turn is the Queen of Clubs, and Doug checks again, and although this card should slightly favor his range, it brings in another straight and results in a very dangerous board. So we see that the out-of-position player continues to check with high frequency, particularly with its weaker pairs, such as Doug's 10-9 off combos. However, having turned 2 pair, Daniel's holding now shoots up his equity distribution against Doug's somewhat capped range, and therefore he should have a strong incentive to begin building the pot. And indeed, we see that most of Daniel's Queen 9 suited combos are betting with this 3/4 pot sizing. And then Doug calls, which is also standard. With Doug checking the flop and the turn, his range should be very showdown value heavy, and so there are a number of weak hands in Daniel's range that will want to take a stab here that Doug will be ahead of. Additionally, Doug has the backup equity provided by the straight draw, which affords him a bit of cushion in case he's behind. Accordingly, we see that all of Doug's second and third pairs that also have a gut shot are calling. Doug checks again, which we see his entire range doing on this blank 4 river, as Daniel now has a significant advantage given Doug's passive play on the flop and turn. Daniel then attempts to extract additional value by firing a 75% pot bet, which is consistent with the solver that's betting all of its 2 pairs, mixing this sizing and shoving, and then the solver shoves with essentially all of its sets plus, employing a very polarized strategy against Doug's bluff catcher heavy range. So Doug, perhaps sensing weakness given that nearly all of Daniel's nuts were shoving in this spot, decides to jam his stack in Daniel's face with third pair. At first glance, you would think that this hand would actually serve as one of Doug's better hero call bluff catchers, since it should be ahead of most of Daniel's bluffs, and it also blocks some of Daniel's straights and 2 pairs. And we do indeed see that the solver is mostly calling with this combo. However, we see that the solver favors folding the 9 of clubs. Not surprisingly, the 9 of clubs has the lowest blocker scores out of all of Doug's 10-9 off combos, likely because it doesn't block Daniel's Queen 9 suited 2-pair combos that should have played this way. However, interestingly, we also see that the solver is in fact mixing in some bluff raises with 10-9 off as well, particularly when holding the 10 of clubs, which has the highest blocker score, possibly because it blocks King 10 of clubs, which is the most likely straight candidate in Daniel's range that would have checked the flop, as it was the only King 10 suited combo that didn't have the backdoor flush draw. So why is a bluff catching candidate simultaneously being played as a bluff? Well, to understand this play, it may be helpful to step back and think big picture about what GTO is designed to accomplish, which is a perfectly balanced set of strategies which neither player can deviate from to increase his expected win rate. In other words, maintaining balance isn't just some cheesy line that I say at the end of each of my videos. Rather, playing in a balanced manner prevents your opponents from shifting strategies to exploit you, and it likely results in your opponents losing an expectation when they attempt to do so. So with this context in mind, when facing Daniel's bet, we know that Doug will have some value combos that he'll want to raise in this spot, namely his straights, sets, and most of his two pairs, and therefore from a GTO standpoint, Doug should also mix in some bluff raises for balance based on the quantity of value combos he has, as well as the size of the bet in relation to the pot. Right, when Hero's range is value heavy, he should incorporate a greater number of balancing bluffs, and as the bet size increases, the ratio of bluffs to value combos should also increase. However, in this specific spot, Doug doesn't have many natural bluffing candidates. Right, he 3-bet pre-flop, check the flop, and check call the turn, so a large portion of his range likely consists of middling hands with some showdown value, as most of Doug's draws either would have bet or raised at some point or made a hand or folded on the turn. But since balance is so critically important to optimal play, when a range doesn't possess many natural bluff candidates, the solver may start to find bluffs with hands that potentially have some showdown value on the river, such as 10-9 off, which has decent blocking properties to straights and two pairs. So why is balancing your range like this so important in GTO in the first place? Well, if your range is not balanced, it creates leaks that may be exposed by someone playing a GTO-based strategy or by an attentive, exploitative opponent. For example, when Daniel faced Doug's check on the river, although his range was mostly polarized, since real-life poker is not a toy game, his range should have also had a certain region of hands that were borderline value bets, generally comprised of combos that barely beat a majority of Doug's calling range. If Doug were to completely remove bluffs from his check-raising range, the EV of Daniel betting all of these borderline hands would have automatically increased because the potential negative outcome of betting for value and then being forced to fold and raise by bluffs would no longer apply. So with bluff raising removed, all of these borderline hands that were previously indifferent between betting and checking are now incentivized to bet to obtain value from Doug's bluff catchers. However, if Doug incorporates an appropriate proportion of bluffs into his check-raising line, then Daniel will need to weigh the potential benefit of getting additional chips from Doug's weaker hands against the risk of Doug potentially check-raise bluffing, thereby forcing Daniel's marginal value betting combos to fold. This additional risk serves as a deterrent that will cause certain thin value combos in Daniel's range to choose to simply check back to realize their equity. And this in turn will protect Doug's marginal hands from losing additional chips, since many of them would have called Daniel's thin value hands that would have otherwise bet when they're not deterred by bluff raises. And although Daniel will still need to fold many of his thin value hands when Doug raises, regardless of whether Doug has bluffs or not, if Daniel knows that Doug only has value raises here, it makes this decision very easy. Daniel simply will fold all of his thin value combos that he knows are behind Doug's check-raising range, which is too value-heavy. However, when Doug incorporates an appropriate ratio of bluffs into his check-raising line, to avoid being exploited himself, Daniel will be forced to top up his defense frequency with marginal bluff catchers that are indifferent between calling and folding, and this in turn increases the EV for Doug's value combos because they are now being called at a higher frequency by weaker hands. Now some of you may be wondering what happens if Daniel just says, "Fuck GTO, I'm not going to play this game, and instead I'm just going to revert back into pure exploit mode." Well, if Doug is check-raising with the correct GTO balance of value and bluffs, Doug will end up profiting no matter which exploitative line Daniel takes. Right, if Daniel decides to simply fold all of his bluff catchers facing the check raise, Doug would profit from his bluffs. And conversely, if Daniel decided to call all of his bluff catchers, Doug would profit from his value combos. So either way, when an exploitative player deviates from the Nash equilibrium strategy against an opponent who's playing GTO, the exploitative player will almost always lose an expectation in the long run. Now, all of this being said, we should keep in mind that bluff raising with a hand that has showdown value in most situations will be a low frequency play. As such, this move is definitely something that most should not try at home unless they have a solid command of range construction. Right, while it is true that raising with bluff catchers does potentially gain additional chips, since they not only win the pot against the bluffs that they would have beat anyways by simply calling, they also get some additional EV by causing thin value combos in villain's range to fold. However, this positive additional EV must also be weighed against the risk that villain has stronger hands that will call heroes bluffs. Against these hands, the bluff catcher is just throwing away good money after bad by check raising. So in other words, before making a high-risk play like this, we must be cognizant of the negative side of the EV ledger, which will also increase when we bluff raise our showdown hand instead of simply calling. Right, since we always want to take the max EV line, we need to be sure that the incremental additional EV we get by bluff raising outweighs the additional risk of running into the nuts, which is a very thin line to navigate. Now, whether Doug specifically is correctly balancing this type of play is unclear. We've seen him make similar moves on a number of occasions, both during this challenge and in his pre-retirement career, so he may be using this line exploitatively, for example if he thinks his opponent has a sizing tell with thin value hands. But in any event, if Doug breaks out this move too often, he runs the risk of being punished by an opponent that's able to adjust by overlapping a greater portion of his nuttish holdings with smaller betting sizes. So that is the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.